we're going to talk about a wonderful, simple, and yes, just beautifully complex and forever topic. The title of this talk is The True Meaning of Kung Fu. And that, I hope, sounds very dramatic to you because it's supposed to be, so that people watch the talk and pay attention. I'm going to go with this in a couple of different directions, but this was inspired by the internal challenge of the week in this dojo, which is for us to take the same kind of mindset and methodology and process that we use to improve ourselves in our technique in martial arts and take that into something in everyday life. Now, I talk about this all the time. In fact, my definition, which I stole from my Sifu, of what a real martial artist is very simple. It's somebody who takes martial arts out into everyday life. And that certainly does not mean that you're punching and kicking random people on the street. This means that you are using the lessons and the skills, more importantly, the internal lessons and internal skills, the focus and our meditative mindset and all of this, and applying that to life. And I usually talk about this in a more general sense because martial arts should touch and affect everything that we do. If you're doing martial arts correctly, real martial arts, it is transformative on a very profound level. And how does that happen? Like the logistics of transforming ourselves and our lives through practice. There are a couple of different ways. And on some level, yes, just practicing martial arts means that things will just start to show up for us. I use a couple of examples all the time, especially when I'm teaching Tai Chi. One of them is I was washing the dishes one day, and I thought, because I noticed that I was very tense and like angry doing the dishes, I thought I should just do this like Tai Chi. And so I started breathing as I was scrubbing the dish and exhaling as I was rinsing the dish off and moving it, from my center as I was putting the dishes away. And it became instantly very enjoyable to do this. But the other way that this should happen is kind of a step-by-step process where we are consciously choosing small details to improve upon. And this is really important because it can get very overwhelming to try to change everything about an activity that we're doing. And in fact, it's probably not going to happen that way, where we just change absolutely everything in order to make it more like martial arts. It's going to happen as we choose one thing and then we choose one detail about that thing. So I'll get more into this later on. But the words Kung Fu do not mean punching and kicking, do not mean self-defense. They don't even mean martial arts. They mean something close to my definition of martial arts, but Wushu actually means martial arts. So Wushu is what we call a kids class, and that is in some ways kind of a more classical way of referring to the physicality of what we do. But Kung Fu or Gong Fu actually translates to something more like wisdom through effort or achievement through skill. There's a connotation of this kind of life's work, the time and energy that you put into it, and how this can show up in everyday life is actually you can have a Kung Fu in anything that you do, and you should. If you're practicing well, it should show up in everything that you do, right? There are a couple of great movies. I referenced these this morning. I love watching martial arts movies, and I don't like watching people beat each other up. I like watching the technique, which is honestly in most Kung Fu movies not very good. But it is really fun when you see a movie that has philosophy in it too. And there are many movies, lots of Bruce Lee's movies do a good job of at least touching on some deeper stuff. But there are two movies by Stephen Chow that I highly recommend you guys watching if you haven't seen them yet. The first one is Shaolin Soccer, and the second one is Kung Fu Hustle. These are both funny, truly great movies with some really decent martial arts in them. But if you're paying attention, you'll get what I'm talking about here. There's a scene, I believe it's at the end of Shaolin Soccer, where Stephen Chen also stars in these movies. Stephen Chow rather stars in these movies, and he's great. But he talks about how you can have a kung fu in anything that you do, and he shows these ridiculous scenes of people like flying through the air and like sniffing their hedges and like doing ridiculous things like this. But the point kind of hits, and you get it. Like, you want to have this kind of attitude or way of being with everyday things. And when you get to a point of mastery with them, it can be the same as what it feels like to have a degree of mastery in martial arts and kung fu practice. In Kung Fu Hustle, in the beginning of the movie, it's very cool. And I'm not gonna give you many spoilers, but I'll just give you like something that happens in the first, I think, 10, 15 minutes of the movie, which is you come to find out it takes place most of the movie in this kind of rundown, almost like a communal living situation. And there are all these people who are just like everyday people, you know, merchants and farmers and bakers and all this, and they're living in this place together. And you see them, this is kind of like foreshadowing what's happening later on in the movie, but these people are using their martial arts skills. And when you find out who they are later on, these kung fu masters who are kind of living in this place, there's one of them who's like a weapons master, and he's rolling out the dough to make these, I forget what he's baking, but he's like using his bow, his martial arts weapon, to do this. And he's not using it in a disrespectful way. He's like loving what he does, and he's pouring himself into it and using the same kind of principles of movement and the same kind of mindset and attitude that then makes him an amazing baker. Because as they say, master one thing, master all things. You, through doing something very difficult and complex like martial arts, you develop a skill set that helps you in many different things in life. And one of the most important things that it helps us to master transform the way that we do everything on a deep level. So when you think of what you do in martial arts every time you come to class, it is not like you show up to class and you're bad at this thing and then magically you just get great at it. That might be your experience of it. And if you just come to class many, 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 many times and you rep techniques many, 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 many times, you'll hit a time, a class, maybe one punch where it clicks and it feels like, oh, it just happened and it was magical. But what is actually happening there is the culmination of so much time and effort. And you're only going to truly get great at this technique that you're throwing if you are trying to improve it every single repetition. So let's say you're doing a front kick, and your front kick, when you first throw it, is just like, you're just like swinging your leg. Your hands are flailing all over the place, and it's like, you don't know what you're doing at all. And at first you might think, I don't know what I'm doing. But you kind of look at yourself compared to other people, and after you feel like you're getting better at what you think is a great front kick, you're like, I'm getting it. This is a great front kick. But then you'll make a leap in understanding where you recognize, either because I say it or you see somebody else with their hands up like this. And then you say, okay, I know that I'm not doing that. So I've got to work on that part. I'm going to keep my hands up. And that is the one thing that you get better on with this rep, but really you want to spend more time with it, right? And when you're practicing on your own at home, this is exactly what you should do as well. You should choose one thing, a specific thing about a specific technique, and then get better at it. Now, at a certain point in your practice, you will have your basics really great. And so then you'll spend less time trying to work on specific individual details of a technique, and you'll start to work on something that's a little bit more broad, or a little bit more open-ended, where it's like I'm working on flow from one technique into the next, or I'm working on my awareness of my body and working on the way that this feels and my experience of it. But it's still a specific thing that you're working on. So if we are able to take that kind of process and methodology and apply it to something else, then we will have the same kind of experience, where at first you will feel like, this is overwhelming, I'm so bad at this, I can't see myself ever getting it. But then you start to piece together these little things, and you're adding these details one at a time, and eventually you end up with enough practice, enough intentional practice with something that is really great. And this is the idea behind the challenge of the week this week is I want you guys to choose something and take one piece of it and actually repeat it, and actually turn it into a martial arts like practice, where you have one thing that you're focused on. And this is so important for us because our minds are not designed to be able to focus on proactively improving more than one thing at a time. Our minds are designed to take in lots of information, and this is kind of what intuition is. But when you're talking about improving the way that your body, especially the way that your body does something, you're not going to just take in all this information and have it happen. You've got to be methodical about it. You've got to choose a piece and rep it. So when you're doing something else, this is what we're trying to do, is just to think about the one thing that we can improve on. I love thinking about the way that I do everyday things. And these are not complex things. I like thinking about the way that I walk. And again, this is something that I talked about all the time in Tai Chi, but in Kung Fu as well. You should think about and feel the way that you're learning how to move your body is very different from the way that you moved before class, right? Just the way that you walked when you first started walking, you haven't really changed much. And you probably don't remember your first steps, but I'm sure you've seen an infant start to walk, and they're like this, and they just basically teeter and they fall from one foot to the other, right? If you pay attention to the way that you walk and you don't try to change anything about it, you'll notice that this is pretty much what you're doing. You're essentially falling from one side to the next. It's smoother than it used to be. And the truth is that's not wrong, because we're kind of using momentum and efficiently moving our body. But if you kind of let that get away from you, walking can actually be very painful. And for me, walking became quite painful for me at a certain point in my life. I was starting to get all of this tension building up in my lower back. And actually, for me, one of the most painful things ever was just walking slowly. And maybe I'd be in a mall, or one of the most brutal days in my life was when I went to the Great Wall of China, and I had an idea of how far I was going to go. And I did the whole thing, but it was so hard. My back was killing at the end, and it was hot and just a rough day in general. But that was one of the straws that broke the camel's back, or my back. And I thought, I got to do something about the dumb way that I'm walking. And so I started applying my Tai Chi to it. And I started, more gliding when I was walking. I stopped thumping and falling. And I started just having this more controlled movement. And it was not like I changed the way that I walked so completely that it looked to an outsider like I was actually doing Tai Chi like this, because people will make fun of you for that. And then you're going to have to, beat them up, which is not the martial artist way. So I just smoothly started walking and keeping my head even. This is the thing that I focused on actually first, was my head's not going to bob up and down. I'm not going to thump side to side. My head's going to stay pretty much where it is as I'm walking in a straight line. And this is something that we do in Tai Chi, but this one specific thing really changed my whole experience of walking and smoothed it out and made it much less painful for me. I was no longer thumping and building up that pressure in my back. And I can walk again. It's a miracle. But the process here is really what we're focusing on. So if I decided, again, I'm just going to replace the way that I walk with doing stroke the bird's tail in Tai Chi, that is a good shortcut, and it can really work for us if you're truly great at doing stroke the bird's tail. But you don't need to do everything in life exactly the way that you do it in martial arts. That's not the point of this challenge or this idea. It's not the point of Kung Fu, right? When you have a Kung Fu in something, you're using the example from Shaolin soccer and you're cutting your hedges, you're not actually flying through the air like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon style and cutting your hedges that way, because that's not the most efficient way of cutting your hedges. It can be a fun way of cutting your hedges, but when you start doing something and you pay attention to it in the same way that you pay attention to your physical movement in class, you'll start to pick up on these inefficiencies. You'll start to pick up on ways that you're overly tensing your body or ways that you're not using your body in the most efficient way. And so then you start to pare those down, right? And so you're cutting the hedges and you're like, all right, I don't need to do this with my arms because this is not the most efficient way of moving, right? I'll use the smaller movements of my body and I'll be more precise with how I'm doing it rather than cutting huge chunks out of the hedge. I just got a house and I've got hedges, which is why hedges are on the tip of my brain right now. I'm thinking about, I've got like all these nice hedges that form this really perfect straight line on this fence. And there's been a gardener who's been taking care of it. And I'm starting to think like, this is going to be like fun for me to try to get these hedges exactly perfectly straight. And I think it's going to take me a long time to get good at that. And it's going to be a disaster in the beginning. I'm going to have holes in the hedges. I'm not going to be like Edward Scissorhands. I'm going to be like, it's going to be a disaster. But eventually I'm going to get it and it's going to be a great lesson for me, right? And then where this really starts to take hold of us is where we are applying this kind of mindset to something outside of our martial arts practice, but then that gives us ideas about the way that we do martial arts. And the way that martial arts really becomes a way of life for us is when we've got this like feedback from one into the next. And the things that I do outside, because I'm doing them with the same kind of awareness as Kung Fu, starts to feed into my Kung Fu practice. And I'm doing my Kung Fu with the same kind of awareness. And everything becomes part of our martial arts practice. So if there is a way to try to kind of holistically, in a more general sense, take our practice out into life, it's actually to take what we're doing in life and put it into our practice. And what I mean by that is what we're doing in class, we're being mindful of our movement, we're being mindful of our thoughts, we're being mindful of our breath. We're learning to be efficient, we're learning to be effective, we're learning to, be totally present. We're learning to be powerful. And when we take something else and essentially imagine, if I were doing this in class right now, I'm lined up in class, Sifu's up there yelling at me, how would I do this thing if I were doing this in martial arts class? And then you can start to get the world of this, right? So very often what people have is this experience of practicing at home, practicing martial arts at home feels like, I don't know what to do. I'm worried about making mistakes and building bad habits, so I'm just not going to practice at all. Well, it doesn't take much thinking to understand that it's impossible for you to get better between classes if you're not practicing at home. Now, you're absolutely right. If you have that thought, there might be some bad habits that you're building, but if you're paying attention, you're going to be building more good habits than bad habits. The way that we arrive at this, or the way that we get past this kind of kung fu writer's block, where we just decide, I just can't do it, I got to stop and give up. The way we get past this is by focusing on one thing at a time. And when we focus on that one detail, we understand that we don't have to get everything perfectly. We just have to get this one thing better. And it frees us up in a way that is super empowering and just a totally different experience when we allow ourselves to just do one thing. We're no longer frantically, moving through life feeling like I've got to get it all. And our society kind of pushes us in this direction of like, I got to do it all and I've got to be everything. And I see people on TV and I see people on Instagram and my social media feeds, and it's like everybody is perfect and they're all doing all these incredible things. Everyone's traveling and everyone's got a better job than me and a more attractive family than me and whatever else. And when you see this, it's so hard not to feel like I've got to be better at everything and I'm a failure. This has not been my experience, because first of all, when I see somebody doing something that looks really great on social media, I think the bad part of me, the small self, thinks like, yeah, they're good at that, but I'm sure they suck at everything else. This is not actually a very helpful way of looking at people in the world. What we want to do is look at them and be happy for them. This is what they say the happiest people in the world do, is they genuinely are happy for other people's successes. I totally digress. My point with this is that while we feel dragged in all these different directions, and our experience of life oftentimes is, I've got to do everything, because we see all of these things that we're supposed to be getting great at, or that we're supposed to be achieving or experiencing in life. This is not the way to be effective or happy. The way to be effective and happy is to choose one thing and focus on it for a period of time and then move on to the next thing. And this is different from, Malcolm Gladwell made this really famous, the idea, I think it was Malcolm Gladwell, the 10,000 hour rule. He's like, you got to just do this one thing and do nothing else but this one thing. That's not actually what he says, but this is the idea that people get from it. They think like, I've just got to totally focus on this. It's the only way to get great at it. But there are lots of studies that actually show the opposite, that when you have a good broad experience, that's going to help you develop more fully, right? But my point is that while you are looking for a decent broad experience, and you don't want to try to push all of these opportunities away, you can't have a broad experience all at once. It's overwhelming and impossible. And if you show up to class, you're doing your first class in a while, and you're like, here it is, I'm going to do this whole combination. It's impossible. And even if you've been coming for years, it's impossible. Notice how I never have you do this. Okay, we're going to do this combination. I block back in, side step, front foot, simultaneous front punch, add the hook punch to the body, and the palm strike over the top. And we're just doing that right from the get-go. It's not going to work for any of you unless it's something that you've done so many times in a combination that you know how to do it. Just in the same way that doing even one technique is difficult for you until you've done it so many times. So what do? We break it down and we focus on one thing at a time. And sometimes we'll add the next technique, And you'll start to get overwhelmed. And you'll feel like, I'm trying to do the next thing, but I didn't get the first thing yet. Okay, so what do? Just focus on the first thing until you get that. And then once you really have that, then you can add onto it. And then you can add onto that. So our practice sometimes feels early on like I'm building this super high, skinny, like Jenga tower, and it's a miracle that the whole thing doesn't collapse in every single class. But what we really want to do is build this base, and it's a very solid base. We get really great at these basic techniques and these basic principles of movement, and we're kind of building up like this, and it looks more like a pyramid. We start with the basics, we start with the principles, and then we build on that until we get to the point where our techniques are super refined and they flow through us naturally. But it all has to come back to focusing on one thing at a time. So when we meditate, how does this happen for us? It is the most perfect example of it. You meditate by just focusing on one thing. You focus on the breath. And even that can seem like too much or too general for many people. What is the breath? What am I focusing on? Am I focusing on the sound that the breath makes, which is what some people do? Am I focusing on the feeling of the breath in my belly? Am I focusing on, am I visualizing the breath? Actually, all of these things can work, but not all of them at the same time, because that's too much for your mind to focus on. In meditation, we want to actually narrow our focus. While we might have the experience of a much larger awareness, what we're trying to do is focus our thoughts so that they become very few and far between. So then we can experience all of our full selves. So I'm going to suggest to you that when you meditate, you don't want to focus on the whole breath. You want to focus on a specific entry point of the breath. Like you can focus on the nose. You can feel the way that the breath comes in through your nose, and you can feel the way that the breath goes out through your nose. If that doesn't work, you can focus on the way that the breath is feeling in and out through your throat, or you can feel how the breath comes in and out from your belly. But focus on the sensation of a specific body part as you feel the breath, and see how that changes it. Now your mind, instead of going like this and it's kind of ebbing and flowing with wherever your mind goes, now it's like totally honed in on that one little piece. And this will get us pretty far in meditation, because now we've let go of many thoughts. Now we're having the experience of being much more in the present and being with a calm mind, an empty mind. But then eventually you want to let even that go. And then you are just experiencing consciousness. You're experiencing presence. You're experiencing your larger self as connected to everything else. So we use the focus on the breath as a tool to calm and still the mind. And then from there, we just feel and be. And this is the way that our physical practice should go. You're sparring and you have to kind of piece together all these little things, and you have to get good at avoiding somebody's punch, and you have to get good at hitting your targets, and all of this, these little things that we focus on one at a time, until we eventually get to a point in sparring where we're good enough that we're not thinking our way through each little thing. We step back, we focus on the breath, and then we just take our whole partner in, and we recognize what they're throwing at us. And then when they throw that technique, we just move naturally, because it's the way that we've programmed our bodies to move. And in a certain mental state and in a certain emotional state, it's going to just flow through us naturally. Same thing in Tai Chi, you learn the form and then it flows through you naturally. So with our meditation tonight, let's really be specific with what we're doing, and let's focus on, I'm going to suggest, if you can do it, focus on the nose. Feel the breath come in through the nose, feel the breath go out through the nose. Now, you guys here are wearing masks, And it might be a little bit more difficult, but you can for sure feel the air. This is something that all of us can do as we're walking out through life with our masks on, is you feel how the breath, you know, fills up the mask as you're breathing out, and then you're coming back in. You can kind of feel the whole breath on your face like this. That's fine too. But try to be as specific and as mindful of one thing as possible, as much as focus as much as you can on one thing as you possibly can. Sure, just meditate really good, okay? And when your mind wanders, rather than letting it wander to, how come I'm such a failure at meditation? I suck at this, like I suck at everything. Just come back to the breath and allow that very simple, specific sensation to pull you completely into the moment in a way that fills you up. So we're going to do that now. Sit comfortably.